Hello, everyone. My name is Heather Moran, and I'm the CEO here at 6th and I. Welcome, thank you to everyone in person and all of you watching from home for joining us for such an important conversation this evening. We are so proud to co-present this program with the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, which is the national convener of Jewish coalitions working across communities to build a just and inclusive American democracy, and with the Tree of Life, a new organization that grew out of the aftermath of a horrific tragedy, which we'll share more about this evening. You are sitting in a sanctuary that was born. The sanctuary was born or built in 1908. This building was a synagogue for 45 years and then an African Methodist Episcopal church for the next 50. When the church relocated and put the building up for sale, someone wanted to turn it into a nightclub, but it was saved within 24 hours, and we recently marked our 20th anniversary as a center for arts, entertainment, ideas, and Jewish life. Thanks. Thank you. Tonight we are here to discuss the critical moment that we're all in together, a critical moment for democracy and our country, and the inextricable link between Jewish safety and our democratic freedoms. Anti-Semitism doesn't only threaten the Jewish community because hate doesn't exist in isolation. Anti-Semitism appears with other forms of bigotry that target historically marginalized groups. When the rights and safeties of persecuted communities are jeopardized, so are our fundamental democratic values. We are gathered tonight to better understand how we can work towards a more inclusive society where the greatest ideals of this country are realized and protected for everyone. It is my sincere pleasure to introduce my colleague and my friend, Carol Zawadzki. I'll be forever indebted to Carol for embracing me as a new Jewish professional leader when I took this job a little more than 8 years ago. Carol is the inaugural CEO of the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh. On October 27th, 2018, 3 congregations were attacked while worshiping at the Tree of Life Synagogue in what remains the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in the history of our country. The Tree of Life is poised to uproot anti-Semitism and hate through a multifaceted and pioneering approach that includes building bridges of empathy and understanding across differences as a catalyst for transcending divisive boundaries. I'd like you all to give a warm 6th and I welcome to my friend Carol Zawadzki.
Thank you, Heather, for those very warm words. To our moderator and panelists, and to everyone here, it is my honor to serve as the inaugural CEO of the Tree of Life and to be with you this evening for this important conversation about anti-Semitism and democracy. As Heather said, nearly 6 years ago, 11 Jewish worshipers from 3 congregations were murdered during Shabbat services. In the hours and days after the attack, the city of Pittsburgh and the world rallied alongside the 3 congregations and came together loudly to oppose anti-Semitism and hate. As members of the Tree of Life congregation and community members began to pick up the pieces and rebuild, they sought to build on the communal response to 1027 and transform the site of tragedy into one of light, hope, and possibility. So in 2022, they launched the Tree of Life, a locally grounded institution with national reach, dedicated to uprooting anti-Semitism and identity-based hate through remembrance, education, celebration, and connection. I invite you to learn more about the Tree of Life by visiting thetreeoflife.org. And thank you once again for joining us today for our conversation with these wonderful speakers. It is my honor to introduce our distinguished panel this evening. The conversation will be moderated by Yolanda Savage-Narva, the Vice President of Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion and Communities of Belonging for the Union of Reform Judaism. Previously, she was the Executive Director of Operation Understanding, a nonprofit dedicated to eradicating racism, anti-Semitism, and all forms of discrimination. She is a member of the 6NI Board of Directors and a member of the Tree of Life's Academic Advisory Committee. Thank you, Yolanda. Congressman Jamie Raskin represents Maryland's 8th Congressional District. He was a firsthand witness to our modern democracy's darkest day on January 6, 2021, when violent insurrectionists stormed the Capitol. Representative Raskin shares an account of this day and its aftermath in his #1 New York Times bestselling book, Unthinkable: Trauma and the Trials of American Democracy. We're so thrilled to have you with us tonight. Amy Spitalnick is the CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. She previously served as the Executive Director of Integrity First for America, which won its groundbreaking lawsuit against the neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups responsible for the Charlottesville violence. Their case serves as a model for accountability. Thank you, Amy. And Maya Wiley is a civil rights attorney and lifelong civil rights advocate. She's the president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, the nation's oldest and largest civil rights coalition. Maya is the author of the new memoir, Remember, You Are a Wiley. I will say I read it, it's terrific. About surviving trauma and the power of activism. We have autographed copies of both Maya and Representative Raskin's books for sales tonight. And thank you all for joining us.
Good evening, everyone. Oh, what an amazing evening. Carol, I want to thank you for such a warm introduction. Thank you to 6NI, Tree of Life, and the Jewish Council for Public Affairs for envisioning, planning, and hosting this very important and timely conversation. I want to thank this esteemed panel for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here tonight. I'm honored to know each of you, and I'm excited to bring this collective brilliance and commitment together on this stage tonight in this historic sanctuary. Last but not least, you and everyone on Zoom, thank you for being here tonight. You're part of this sacred community. I look forward to hearing from some of you later on tonight during the Q&A. So I want to invite each of you to join me and just take a deep breath. One deep breath. That's pretty good. And ground yourselves in this moment that we're in this sacred community. There is so much going on in this world, in every corner of the world. Some things impact some of us directly. Other things impact us all indirectly. Like it or not, believe it or not, we are all linked. A healthy democracy, equitable and just systems, and fighting together for a world without hatred and bigotry isn't going to just magically happen and appear from the sky. We know that the moral arc of the universe is long, and it tends to bend toward justice. But we need to bend it. We need to pull it in the direction of justice. And that is exactly what we are doing tonight. And that is why the opportunity to hear from Maya Wiley, Congressman Raskin, and Amy Spitalnick discuss the major issues that are plaguing us is so very critical. So I want to dive in. I just want to give a quick reintroduction of myself. Yolanda Savage-Narva, I use she, her pronouns. We are in the historic synagogue, 6th and I. We are also on the unceded tribal land of the Pamunkey and Piscataway people. For those who are experiencing visual impairments, I'm a black woman with an afro wearing mostly black clothes tonight. I've asked each of our panelists to open with something that inspires them to do this work, especially in the moment that we're in. I said I would quickly model it and turn it over. There is a quote by Maya Angelou that I think about every single day I do the work that I'm doing. In 1973, Maya Angelou was interviewed by Bill Moyers, and she traveled around a lot. She was in different places, and he asked her, "Do you ever feel like you belong?" And Maya Angelou said, "You know, you belong no place. You belong every place, no place at all. The price is high, but the reward is great." And I think about that often, and I think about the shoulders that I stand on, the ancestors who made it possible for me to be here and do this work. And that is one of the things that inspires me today to do what I do. Maya, may I ask you to kick us off and share with us what inspires you and anything you want to share with us in your opening statement?
Well, thank you. Ooh. I will speak lightly, which is not easy for me. Well, first, let me say what an incredible honor it is to be in this historic synagogue. What an incredible privilege it is to be with you, Yolanda, to be with my incredible leader, Amy Spitalnick, because JCPA is a founding member of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, which does turn 75 next year. So that is... Our origin story is one of unity. It is one that is black and Jewish. And Jamie Raskin, who is both an incredible leader, I think we all know that, an incredible constitutionalist in his own right, and he's in my book.
Oh, wow.
And he doesn't remember why. And I'm not going to tell him. But it's a childhood story because our parents knew each other, because this is also the history of the civil rights movement, personally as well as professionally. But what I will say that my parents taught me, and that was something that was very much imbued in every single day and in every single way of what they modeled, but also what I saw in the movement, and what I remember today when I have to sometimes keep moving on hard days, which is in the Bible, in Luke, but it's basically to those who have been given much, much is expected. And the higher you rise, the greater the demand to do it right.
Thank you, Maya. Congressman Raskin, would you like to share?
Yes, indeed. Yolanda, thank you for introducing us and moderating us, and thanks to the splendid people at 6th and I for organizing us. It's very meaningful, and it's great to be here with Amy and my childhood chum, Maya Wiley, who I always loved from a very, very young age. Let's see. My staff told me there was one thing I needed to do to prepare for this, and they told me, and then I forgot to do it. But there are several passages. I suppose this is more authentic because I carry them around with me in my heart. And one is from the great Tom Paine, and I've really had this in my heart really since this difficult period in our history began. And, you know, Tom Paine, who my son Tommy was named after, he came over to these shores in 1774, 2 years before the American Revolution. And he fell in love with the promise of America. And he wasn't blind to any of its faults. He was an abolitionist in the 18th century. He was fighting for women's suffrage. But he fell in love with the promise of this land because he saw it could be organized around a different principle. Because until America, all of the countries had been organized around kings and queens and czars and monarchs and emperors and all of that. And they posited a different idea. And he wrote Common Sense. Everybody knows the pamphlet that ignited the American Revolution. And by that, he meant kind of a sixth sense, that we all have the sense of sight and sound and touch and smell and taste. But there's another sense we have, our common sense, the sense we have in common when we're willing to reason together to achieve common goals without church superstition and without propaganda, what we would call today fake news and conspiracy theory and all of that. But anyway, the American Revolution started, and it was a very tough time because half of the people thought, no, you really can't beat the kings and queens and the autocrats and the monarchs. That's the fate of humanity. And then there were those who were saying, let's gamble on democracy and freedom and rights, and let's pledge to each other our sacred honor, our fortunes, and our lives to try to make this happen. But it was a tough time, not unlike today. Could have gone this way, could have gone that way. People didn't know. And it reminds me a little bit of where we were in America maybe 3 months ago, maybe 4 months ago, I can't remember exactly. But a lot of people were walking around and feeling despondent and depressed and hopeless, you know. And so at a time like that, Paine wrote this pamphlet called The American Crisis. So anyway, I'm just quoting you this little passage. I'm going to update the language pursuant to instructions from Nancy Pelosi, because she said Tom Paine was a feminist, and that he was, and so she likes the quote a lot better if we make it so that it doesn't offend modern sensibilities. But anyway, he wrote this, and this is the thing that George Washington had the troops reading out at Valley Forge. President Biden talked about this not long ago. But Paine wrote, "These are the times that try men and women's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will shrink at this moment from the service of their cause and their country. But everyone that stands with us now will win the love and the favor and the affection of every man and every woman for all time. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, but we have this saving consolation. The more difficult the struggle, the more glorious in the end will be our victory." Tom Paine.
Wow. Oh my goodness. Thank you. Thank you both. Amy.
Well, now I have to follow Congressman Raskin and Tom Paine. Well, first I'll just start by echoing my gratitude to Tree of Life and Carol and to Sixth and I, Heather, and the incredible team here. If I could have dreamed up a group of people to talk about these issues with, this would be it. I would say Maya and I know each other back from New York government. In addition to our organization's deep history, Congressman Raskin was, I think, the first congressman to really come out in support of our Charlottesville case years ago, even if you might not remember that. And it was incredibly meaningful. And Yolanda, you and URJ are just some of our closest partners in this work. And so this is really just a dream to be able to be here. I'm not going to quote Tom Paine or the Bible, but rather share a framework that I think really informs everything we do and hopefully this conversation. And I try to remind myself of this every hour of every day as we do this work. We simply cannot protect democracy and advance any community's rights and safety unless we confront anti-Semitism, and so too can we not protect Jewish safety if we're not advancing inclusive democracy and ensuring each and every community's rights and safety. And it's this framework that really governs everything that we do in our work at JCPA, and if we're ever going to do any of the things we're here to talk about tonight, counter anti-Semitism, protect democracy, ensure a more inclusive America, we need to recognize that it cuts in both directions and we can't do one without the other.
Yes. Thank you so much. Well said, beautiful. I really appreciate you sharing. So each of you have a unique approach to fighting for democracy and fighting against hatred and fighting against extremism. And the name of our panel tonight is Antisemitism, Democracy, and the Struggle for an Inclusive America. How do we begin to make sense of the complexities of these intersecting challenges that we are up against? Rising anti-Semitism, the possible erosion of democracy as we know it, and the continuous struggle of co-creating a truly inclusive America. Do we tackle one before the other? How do we make sense of this, and how do we even begin to address what's happening? And I will open it to whoever would like to go first.
Okay, everybody's looking at me. Okay, but everybody's looking at me. So one, let me just say, unless we're willing to look at the roots, we can't dig up the poison tree.
Yes.
And the roots are deep, and they are shared roots. So to me, both centrally important to acknowledge, confront anti-Semitism. And the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights does that. But we do it in a framework, and it's very similar to what Amy was sharing, which is when we're sitting here talking, let me just say one thing that's, I just want to say one thing before I go to the framework. So when the Tree of Life happened, when that massacre happened, I happened to check in on a friend, old friend from the U.S. Attorney's Office days. Years later, we were still friends. But what I didn't know when I was checking on her, she's Jewish, what I didn't know is that her brother-in-law was one of the 11. I also recognized immediately that I didn't know what to do. Yeah. Because what do you do other than say, I'm so sorry, what do you need? But what became very important very quickly was because there had been relationship between Jewish leaders and black leaders and imams in Pittsburgh, that immediately and rapidly there was a collective response to the Tree of Life synagogue murders. I say that because one of the realities is relationship matters. And a deep understanding of shared experience matters. But then that also means a shared understanding is that when Tops Supermarket had 10 black people shot and killed, what was the underlying ideological hate foundation? What was that deep root? The Great Replacement Theory. When Dylan Roof showed up at Emmanuel AME Baptist Church, what was the ideology underpinning it? Great Replacement Theory. Well, who's being replaced by whom? Because that's not just about, so we have a shared problem, and it's called, we would call it white supremacy, and see neo-Nazism included in that. I don't see a distinction. If I see the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers or the proletarians, I see the same roots. When I see anti-Semitism, I think of who's coming from my community. When I see, and it's not only me, I'm just personalizing it because it's personal. But it's also the deep and long-standing recognition that we have had as a civil rights community that either we stand together or we fall apart. But this is the other thing that I think is so important, and it's been so difficult over the last lots of months since October 7th, is how do we understand our shared foundation even if there's disagreement, which is also not new. And it brings us back to acknowledging that every single human life has value and deserves protection, and that we have to find a way to have the hard conversations within family, recognize we are a family, which we have done in coalition, which I'm grateful to have had Amy a part of and many other leaders. But we have those conversations in family and come back, and the shared agreement was either we stay together or we fall apart, because we do have a deeply shared common ideological enemy, and it was expressed in Charlottesville. And when we passed the Heather Heyer Khalid Jabara no hate crime law, it was because we said we will stand together and refuse to fall apart.
Thank you, Maya.
Couldn't agree more. And I want to sort of dive in specifically to some of the ways in which we know these issues are intertwined. You spoke about the Great Replacement theory. 7 years ago in Charlottesville, when we watched those images of Nazis with torches chanting, "Jews will not replace us," many of us were a little confused. We were asking what Jews were not going to replace who. And in the 7 years since then, we've seen this fringe idea become wholly normalized in our politics, in our society, in our media, in the rhetoric that is now just mainstream. It fueled the Tree of Life attack, the Poway attack, the Buffalo attack, the El Paso attack, and a variety of other attacks. And so what that tells us is that this idea, this anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, rooted in the idea that Jews are a powerful cabal seeking to replace the white race with black and brown people, immigrants, refugees, and others, doesn't just threaten Jews, as we saw in Pittsburgh and Poway, but black people, immigrants, refugees, the Latino community, the Muslim community, the LGBTQ community. It goes on and on. And these same ideas have fueled not just a cycle of violence and hate, including the hate crimes that I mentioned and so many other incidents that might not grab the headlines, like those mass attacks, but are happening in communities around the country, but also dehumanizing policies targeting the LGBTQ community, targeting reproductive freedom, targeting so many others. We see it, of course, in the horrific anti-immigrant rhetoric that has been wholly normalized in the last few months, including targeting the Haitian community. And so we know over and over again how these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories don't just make Jews unsafe, but make each and every other community unsafe, and fundamentally our democracy. We saw it on January 6th with those saying "Stop the Steal" and the anti-Semitic rhetoric and imagery that was on display there. And I also want to note that in a post-October 7th world, there's something else happening as well that's making it harder for us to build the coalitions we need to confront this anti-democratic extremism that's coming largely from the right, which is that on the far left, we're seeing efforts in certain cases to keep Jews or quote-unquote Zionists out of certain coalitions. And when we effectively seek to ban and boycott Jews from certain spaces, whether it be on what we're seeing on certain campuses or some of what's happening in academic or literary or artistic communities, it in turn divides the very coalitions we need to be building to confront this rising tide of anti-democratic extremism that's coming for each and every one of us. And so we need to be clear-eyed about the way these different threats are manifesting. On the right, we are seeing violent, normalized hate that has led to the mass attacks like Tree of Life and Charlottesville and Buffalo and so much more, increasingly mainstreamed by elected officials. And on the left, particularly in this post-October 7th world, ways in which conversation around Israel has made it harder for Jews to be in the coalitions and the spaces we need to be in. And the threats are not the same, but they both need to be confronted in order for us to protect our democracy in this moment and make sure that each and every community is safe. Because again, we can't confront racism, white supremacy, anti-LGBTQ hate, Islamophobia, anti-immigrant hate without confronting the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that are so often at the core. And so too, as these communities are dehumanized and our democratic norms and values are eroded, Jews are made less safe, anti-Semitism is allowed to fester, and we know where that leads. And so we need to be clear-eyed about how this is all operating, be clear-eyed about the different threats coming from different directions, and not let the extreme voices tear us apart at a time when they are working so desperately to do so.
So I agree so profoundly with what Maya and Amy just said. I would almost be content to leave it alone, but you know, in the House of Representatives, we only get 1 minute to speak usually, and here I've got a few minutes, and so I'm going to take advantage of it. But I want to add one thing, which I think might be a Tom Painian type point, because Paine wrote in Common Sense that America, he said, if it lived up to its principles and its values, would become an asylum to humanity. Not an insane asylum, mind you, but a place of refuge for people seeking freedom from religious and political and economic persecution from all over the world. And so he, in some sense, predicted and he would have welcomed the extraordinary mosaic of diversity and inclusion that's the real America, the America that's constantly struggling to be born towards a more perfect union. And even with all of the authoritarianism and nihilism and fanaticism and anti-Semitism and racism, never forget, we are still the world's greatest multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural, constitutional democracy. We really are. And so I want to agree strongly with what both of you just said about the necessity of coalitional politics and understanding that the Jewish community must defend itself against anti-Semitism, because if I'm not for myself, then who will be for me? But the other part of it is, if I'm not for myself, then what am I, right? And so we have to support each other. But and all of that is true, and that coalitional politics has been such an important part of progress in America, and I believe in it strongly, but it leaves me just a little bit unsatisfied. Because if you go back to Tom Paine, you go back to a lot of our great political visionaries, like Dr. King and Frederick Douglass. We could name a bunch of them, but they didn't stop at the point of just coalitional politics, which has a transactional quality to it. They believed that there was a civic faith in America through which we all could reason together and grow together and act together. So if I'm attacked as a Jew by neo-Nazis and extreme rightists, as I am frequently, talk to the interns in my office who have to answer the phones. If I'm attacked as a Jew, I've got to defend myself as a Jew, but I also have to defend myself as a citizen. Someone who wants to live in a society where we are not defined by other people's concepts of our characteristics ascribed to us by virtue of race, religion, ethnicity, religion, or what have you. One of the great things about living in a pluralist liberal democracy is those people who come here from around the world and those people who've been brought here from other places, as with the African diaspora and enslavement. But those people who are here can hang on to whatever they want from what they see as the old country and what they learned from their parents, and they can make the very best of the traditions that they view as part of their culture, their religion, their belief system, but they also have the opportunity to cross over and meet other people from other faiths and other beliefs and other systems, and also create something that is uniquely American, that is really different from what exists around the world. And I want to hang on to my belief in that. So count me in all the way for coalitional politics and defending anybody who's under attack by the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the Ku Klux Klan, MAGA, Donald Trump, whoever it is, but also count me in for a positive vision, not just a defensive vision, but a positive vision of what America can still become as the world's greatest multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic constitutional democracy, seeking a more perfect union for everybody. Yeah.
You know, I'm just listening to this, and it's really giving me goosebumps because I think it's really important for us to remember and understand and recognize how important the roots are and how important we are in thinking about how they are permeating everything that we're doing, how important relationships are, and how important it is in times when there's nothing going on and in times of need as well. And, you know, it's interesting right now, I think especially post-October 7th, that we're in this really weird posture of pointing fingers, and there's such a trauma response that I think we're all dealing with. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about is racism. And we all know that this socially constructed hierarchy is one of the root causes of many issues in this country. When we think about the rise in anti-Semitism and the many reasons for it, there are many. We describe anti-Semitism as anti-Semitism on the left and anti-Semitism on the right. I know that we have also been in a real battle and struggle around DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I know it's the work that I do that this has really been a very challenging topic because right now, DEI is being weaponized as one of the reasons for anti-Semitism. And so I think those are things that we have to wrestle and struggle with and talk about, especially during this time when we're trying to build an inclusive America. How do we address that? What are some things that we can do to be in partnership with our coalition partners around making sure this is something that we are all focused on and supporting, and we're addressing the challenges that come along with it as well?
I can start because I think, look, as you mentioned, Yolanda, you know, it's almost a year since October 7th, and I actually remember sitting right here at 6th and I a couple weeks after October 7th. There was a big Jewish communal event right before I left on a solidarity trip with other CEOs to visit the communities that were impacted, and I think it was the last time I was in the sanctuary, and we're now almost a year later, and we're still in trauma, and it's important to recognize that the war is ongoing. There are hostages that remain. There are Palestinians being killed in Gaza, and now there's a second front in the war that's opening up. And we are still in trauma as a Jewish community, as a Palestinian American and Arab American community, and as human beings who are watching what's going on, and that is governing so much of what we are all feeling right now. And we have to recognize that trauma because it's going to keep informing how we think about this moment. And there is also very real anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and anti-Arab hate that is manifesting here at home. We have seen it on campuses. We've seen it in hate crimes, targeting my own synagogue last fall. We've seen it in the murder of a 6-year-old Muslim child in Chicago last fall and attacks on other students. And so we know that we're still in this trauma, and we know that it's really scary. And there are also those who are weaponizing what is happening to go after our fundamental democratic values and to pit our communities against each other. People who are claiming that, to your point, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion is somehow inherently anti-Semitic, and therefore we need to kill it all in order to actually protect the Jewish community, who are going after folks like Claudine Gay, the first Black president of Harvard, who are raising legitimate concerns about anti-Semitism on campus to undercut our fundamental democratic liberal values, whether it's DEI or education or anything else. And that doesn't serve any of us. Yeah. We need to be able to do both things. We need to be able to confront anti-Semitism wherever it exists across the spectrum and removed from the ideological spectrum. And we need to recognize that there are extreme voices who are exploiting our pain and our trauma in this moment to pit our communities against each other and to undermine our fundamental values. And we can do both things. It is possible to do both things. It just means ignoring those loud extreme voices who want to continue pitting us against each other and distract from what we know we need to do. This is at the core of the work we're doing at JCPA. We launched 2 action networks this summer focused on protecting democracy and countering hate and bigotry, where we are doing a lot of the work to protect DEI and counter book bans and protect voting rights and counter anti-Semitism and all forms of hate. Because again, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can hold complexity and nuance, and these loud voices need to be pushed to the margins.
I agree. Thank you, Amy.
So Jamie said something that goes directly to this point, which is, what are we for? What's our vision for the country? I had to testify before the House Oversight and misnamed Oversight and Accountability Committee, which should be more appropriately named. What shall we call it, Jamie? Okay, never mind.
We'll do that next Congress.
Sorry. Because it literally is the weaponization of the people's house against the people. That's all it is. It should be called a House Weaponization Against the People Committee. But I say that because literally, think about this. How many of you are against diversity? Raise your hand. No one? How many of you are against equity? Raise your hand. Gee, no one? How many of you are against inclusion? Raise your hand. No takers? So why would we capitulate to a vision of this country that says we should not be diverse, we should not be equitable, and we should not be inclusive? Because that is the vision. I mean, Jamie laid it out. That is the original ideal of an American society that it never was. And all we're talking about is the continuing effort to confront, talk about, and address how we continue to perfect our schools, perfect our relationships, perfect our places of work. But I will say this. So since none of us are against it, then all of us have to proclaim that we're for it. Because to not do that is to capitulate to those who are claiming those are bad words. And once you say they're bad, and that is exactly what was happening. I'm pointing to Jamie because he was actually chairing as a minority, but we'll change that. Yes, we will. And I want to go back to, because this is, I completely agree with the point about coalition is not coalition if it's transactional, y'all. That is not coalition. That's performance. When we do coalition, it's because we have the hard conversations on exactly this point. What Amy is talking about, we've had hard, and we have more hard conversations to come, because you know what? Really painful for the black community to watch the first black woman president of Harvard get kicked out of that job. That was traumatizing. There are all kinds of ways we're all traumatized, and that does require us to have in the civic tradition real honest conversations about both what we need to be to stand up for diversity, equity, and inclusion, what that means, because it has always meant everyone. True diversity and equity and inclusion has always meant everyone. And I learned this the hard way, because when I went up to Dartmouth College, I'm sorry, I don't know why, for college, it was my first experience. No, it's for real though. So we had this thing, so my point is, I go up there for college, coming from DC, where I thought Jews and white people were one and the same, because most of the white people I knew were Jewish, except my mother, but she kept telling me to marry a Jew because they're good at arguing with God, so I don't know, maybe. And I did have babies with a Jew. But here's my point. I go up to Dartmouth, and for the first, it's all true, it's in the book. But I go to Dartmouth, and for the first time in my life, the sukkah was desecrated my freshman fall. And I'd never, ever in a million years imagined what that was. But you know what we had on campus? An interracial concerns committee, which today would be vilified as DE&I. And it was my first experience talking to students about how Jewish students were passing on campus, not wearing the yarmulkes. I was like, y'all passing? What? Are you serious right now? It was like totally insane. But how would I know that if I didn't have an interracial concerns committee? Where black students and Native American students and Jewish students got together and had these conversations and actually talked about what it meant that there was a desecration of the sukkah, or what it meant that there was an article in a Dartmouth Review saying, Abi's a black student at Dartmouth. Or that Native Americans, that we still had the Native American symbol for the football team, even though there was a Native American charter to educate Native Americans. That's how Dartmouth got established. I'm only saying all of that because if we don't remember what this is really about, they win. And the reason we have coalition isn't and never can be just transactional, but it also has to be the place where we have the quiet, hard conversations. And sometimes they're really difficult. Harvard was a real good example, but that is the civic tradition, and it is exactly how we should define coalition.
Yeah, I agree with that so much too. But let me just add only an optimistic spin on it, because I'll quote somebody else. I'll quote Frederick Douglass, who said, if there's no struggle, there's no progress. And the struggle may be moral, it may be physical, it may be moral and physical, but there must be struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand, and it never will.
Never
and so,
has.
Yolanda, you started by asking about race and racism. And of course, racism is the original sin of the slave republic that we began as. And race, I believe, as you put it, is a social construction. It was specifically the construction of racism. It was used as a subordinating ideology, an enslaving ideology. And that was the poison that was put into our bloodstream very early in the birth and the growth of America. And we've grown away from that through Frederick Douglass-style social, political, constitutional struggle. And, Douglass is a hero to me because he never lost faith in the Constitution. And, even when other people were burning the Constitution, saying that it was a pact with the devil, he said, no, we find what's best in there, and we keep building and we keep growing. And if you read the Constitution the way I do, the vast majority of the constitutional amendments we've had since the original Bill of Rights are democratizing amendments, right? The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment gives us equal protection due process. The 15th Amendment bans race discrimination in voting. The 17th Amendment shifts the mode of election of the U.S. senators from the legislatures to the people. The 19th Amendment doubles the franchise by giving women the right to vote. In America, the 23rd Amendment gives people in Washington, D.C. at least the right to vote for president, though not for Congress. The 24th Amendment banned poll taxes, and the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18. So the whole trajectory of our development is towards greater democracy. And the struggle that we're in today, and I know it can feel to people like just a constant repetition of everything we've gone through before, and there may be ingredients of that in there, but in truth, I see it as the last gasp for violent, Christian white nationalist, racist supremacy ideology, because they're losing, and they know they're losing, and they're a minority and a shrinking minority in the country, because the vast majority of the American people believe in the sacred civic faith of a more perfect union, of life, liberty, and property for everybody being created equal, the consent of the governed. And that, I think, is the triumphant political and civic ideology for America. And the MAGA forces arrayed against it, the people who, invite Nicolas Fuentes, the neo-Nazi Holocaust revisionist over for dinner, the people who ran the TV ad in 2016, the closing ad of the GOP campaign with, I think it was Janet Yellen and George Soros and Lloyd Blankfein saying, these globalists are not on your side. All of those people understand that their only chance for maintaining the kind of reactionary power over our society that they want is through anti-democratic mechanisms, the gerrymandering of our state and federal districts, voter suppression laws across the country, the filibuster, right-wing judicial activism, stacking and packing and gerrymandering the Supreme Court. All of those things are an attempt to deny the clear American majority the opportunity to govern. So today, the defense of rights of specific minority groups under attack, the African American community, the Jewish community, the Latino community, Asian Americans, the LGBTQ community, the defense of all of those minority rights is the defense of democracy at the same time. And so what can feel very depressing and dangerous, the moment we're in, is also a moment of great hope and possibility for building the democracy of everybody's dreams.
I think Amy and Maya, we want to close because we want to give the audience some time to do some Q&A. Briefly, hope. What's there for you? What are you feeling? What's the thing that gives you hope in this really challenging time that we're in?
You know, it's been a really challenging probably 7-8 years in terms of these issues in America. The spike in hate crimes that we're talking about started November 2016, not accidentally. And we saw Charlottesville, Pittsburgh, and the cycle of violence we've talked about. And then the last year, as of course we've acknowledged, has just been particularly traumatic for the Jewish community and for others. And what has been consistent to me throughout all of this, but particularly maybe even the last year when so many people are saying we need to walk away from the table, we need to walk away from coalitions, is that actually leaning into those conversations, leaning into those coalitions is where the greatest progress is made. So I will say, I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, Maya. One of the first calls I got after October 7th was Maya, who just wanted to see if I was doing okay. You didn't have to do that, but that is what being in relationship and being in coalition with people is. And a couple of months ago, a number of loud voices on various sides of the political spectrum weren't particularly thrilled that I agreed to do a webinar with Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to talk about anti-Semitism. She invited me to speak to her social media followers, of which she has many, to talk about anti-Semitism and democracy. And we had, I think, a really frank conversation where we didn't avoid the elephants in the room. We talked about Israel and Gaza and the fact that we disagree on parts of the policy that we need to see there. And we also said at the end of the day, we know our futures and our safety are intertwined. Her as a Latino woman, me as a Jewish woman. And then she said a number of remarkable things, including recognizing that the fight against anti-Semitism was inherent to progressive values and to the fight for peace in the Middle East. And also the next day spoke out really powerfully about this horrific anti-Semitic protest in New York against the Nova Memorial. And it was only by leaning into those hard conversations and not walking away from the table, despite the most extreme voices, from the right wing of the Jewish community, and I would say from the far left, some of whom actually unendorsed her after this webinar that she did. It was only by leaning into those conversations that we actually were able to both, I think, move the needle forward on issues that were so extraordinary. I see my friend Stacy Burdett, who was part of that webinar with us, and I want to shout her out, my JCPA board member and friend. And we need to just stay at the table. We need to build the muscle to stay at the table and have the hard conversations. And obviously there are red lines. But in a moment when so many people are telling us to walk away, the only thing we can do is stay at the table, stay in coalition, and keep fighting for our democracy and for all of our safety right now.
Thank you. And lean into the multiple truths that are there, because there are many.
At the end of the day, it's people. And Jamie said it, and I 100% agree, which is we are the majority of this country. We who believe in freedom, we who believe in justice, we who believe in equality, we who believe that we're all in this together. But where I've seen it, and this happened very recently, we had one of our really amazing leaders, Maya Wiley, who co-chairs our Hate Crimes Task Force, went to a Senate Judiciary hearing on hate crimes. And as you know, I want to tell you, we just keep setting historic record after historic record year after year on the rise of hate crimes, and only 1% of them are reported. And so she starts, an Arab American leader, Arab American Institute, and she starts with exactly our formula, which is all of us, and she names anti-Semitism. And then she gets the most hate-filled, abusive, racist questioning from two senators in particular. But I see immediately my Jewish leaders, our Jewish leaders, but they're friends, I consider them mine, including Amy, immediately reaching out to me. What are we going to do? Are we putting out a statement? We need a statement. Reaching out to Maya Wiley and saying, are you okay? We're with you. That was horrible. What do you need? That is exactly what Amy is talking about, and that happened just a week ago. It's all blurring. It was a week ago. But it's only one example that we really are the majority, and that really, as we have very hard struggle, that we have it together.
So anti-Semitism is the gateway to destruction of liberal democracy, and racism is the exact same. So I derive hope, I suppose, from a few different places. One is I look back in history to see that people here in America and all over the world have faced odds as seemingly difficult and insuperable as the ones we face today, and people have had far fewer resources to fight back against hatred than we have, and against division and social destruction. So we've got tremendous resources, human resources, intellectual resources, artistic, cultural, musical, spiritual, religious. We've got amazing resources to fight back against all of it. But we can look back to prior generations who have fought for a more perfect union. I think about Maya Wiley's dad, George Wiley, who's the founder and the president of the National Welfare Rights Organization, who had a civic vision of a society that was not so polarized and divided by wealth, where some people had, yachts and airplanes and, multiple houses, and whether they earned it properly or they got it the old-fashioned way by stealing it with bribes and stuff like that. But regardless, where some people live in like kings and queens, or better than kings and queens used to live, and then other people live with nothing, destitute. He was a great man, George Wiley, who devoted his life to that proposition of dramatically reducing those gaps of wealth and income in our society, and had that positive vision of going forward. And he wasn't, I feel like when I look back, I know it's easy to romanticize people who came before us and we weren't really there, so we didn't know them. But when I look at, I read Taylor Branch's books about King and Parting the Waters, I read Bob Moses' book, Radical Equations and stuff, they didn't talk a lot about coalition. They were just in movement, in positive movement together with the other good people they could find. And it wasn't like, well, my group is going to support your group if your group supports my group. But, that wasn't what Schwerner and Cheney and Goodman were doing in Mississippi in the Freedom Summer. They were going to try to register everybody to vote, to make dramatic changes, to give everybody in America the right to vote unimpeded, a right we're still fighting for today. But I derive a lot of hope from the way people in that generation lived and what they were committed to, and the way that they saw the integration of the problems, or what we would call intersectionality today. So I get a lot of hope by reading. I read about the American revolutionaries. I read about Lincoln and Douglas and the Civil War and Reconstruction. I read about the people, the union leaders, all of the civilizing movements of our times, the feminists. But I gotta say, what's given me the most hope these days is the young people. And I know a lot of them. You know, my wife and I, you know, had 3 kids, and so we know our kids and all their friends. And I, you know, I'm the oldest person in my office by far, I think. Everybody who works for me is young. But it is a generation that's really beyond racism and misogyny and homophobia and immigrant bashing and anti-Semitism and all of the monsters from the last century. That's why I know we're going to win, because they're beyond it. Now, they're also a little bit beyond grammar, too. That's a different problem. And, you know, that's probably got a little more to do with, you know, the tweeting and the texting and all that. But the young people give me a lot of hope. And look, I don't mean to sound too partisan here. I don't want to compromise anybody's 501c3 status or anything. But, you know, Hillary, although she lost in the Electoral College, beat Trump by more than 3 million votes. Joe Biden, who won in the Electoral College, 306 to 232, trounced Donald Trump by 7.5 million votes. And we've got 14 or 15 million new people voting in 2024. If we had a popular vote for president, if we elected the president the way we elect mayors and governors and representatives, it wouldn't even be close. So I'm given hope by the people. My dad used to say, when everything looks hopeless, you're the hope. And I'm seeing a lot of hope out there tonight. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Congressman Raskin. And we know you do have to there.
Oh, I got to leave.
Yes.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you
Maya.
so much.
All right.
Take care. Take care. Okay. Okay, we will get to audience questions right now, I promise. So we have quite a few. Thank you so much for submitting your questions in advance. I think we'll start with this one. It's asking, how can our communities respond to the violent nexus involved with anti-Semitism besides fortifying our sacred spaces?
This is a great question. And look, I recognize the irony of me saying this when the work I did for years before this was to sue neo-Nazis. But we can't prosecute, barricade, or sue our way out of this crisis. We need to do those things. We need accountability and we need security. They matter. We need to make sure that security, of course, is reflecting the diversity of the Jewish community and not also isolating and marginalizing our own members of the diverse Jewish community. And we need accountability desperately. We have seen that over and over again. But at the core, the only way that we are going to fundamentally uproot anti-Semitism is recognizing that we need to build democratic resiliency in this country. Because anti-Semitism, yes, it operates like a form of racial, religious, or ethnic bigotry. But as we've talked about tonight, it's also this pernicious, insidious conspiracy theory rooted in lies and tropes about Jewish control and power intended to sow distrust in our democracy. It is a core tool of anti-democratic extremism, or the gateway to the end of liberal democracy, as the Congressman described it. And so, just as we need to uproot anti-Semitism to protect democracy, we need to build democratic resiliency to fundamentally uproot anti-Semitism. And so that means, yes, nonprofit security grants and accountability for extremists on all levels and calling it out. It can't be considered partisan to call out anti-Semitism, including when it comes from a presidential candidate preemptively blaming the Jewish community for his potential loss, right? We need to normalize calling it out and making it not partisan to do so no matter where it exists. And we need to be investing in voting rights, in fundamental civil rights, in countering disinformation, in countering book bans and curriculum bans and other curriculum challenges, and hate crime prevention, so that we are not just holding people accountable, but fundamentally building resiliency in our society so that we're not just being responsive, so we're not just barricading and prosecuting and suing our way out of this crisis.
Beautiful. Thank you, Amy.
What she said.
I agree. There are some interesting questions here. So we haven't talked about college campuses. So we'll dive in there just a bit. Why are America's college campuses such hotbeds for anti-Israel activity? And what is the best way to be equitable and respect the rights of free speech on college campuses, and at the same time, respect the rights of Jewish students to not be harassed and to walk around and not be harassed and unfettered?
So I'll start, but I know you have a lot of wisdom on this, Amy. I mean, look, I think one of the things we have to recognize is our college campuses, particularly since the second half of the 20th century, but even before that, have always been hotbeds. They're supposed to be hotbeds. I mean, we're asking students to engage civically, as Jamie said. Yeah. I think one of the things I've been reflecting on, and I have college-age children, who have very strong views of their own, who are the grandchildren of a Holocaust survivor, and they are very angry about what's happening to Gazans, right, to Palestinians. And we've had this, it's been a really fascinating conversation because I recognize that there are two things that are happening. If you think about, and Jamie talked about Goodman, Cheney, and Swerner, well, we had an active infrastructure for developing strategy for nonviolent protest. And in the principle and ideology of nonviolence as a mechanism to radical change. I think about that because they were actual trainings. And that doesn't mean there was always agreement or everything was neat and clean. That's not my point. But there was an actual pedagogy, and there were institutions that engaged in developing those strategies and thinking about what it means to build the tent, that the intention was always to make it bigger, to get folks to engage and see and understand what the experiences were that were driving the protest. So I think about that a lot as something we can still do, because even in the conversations I've had with and it's just interesting to watch and ask questions about what's the outcome, what's the strategy? Is it building the tent? Is it shrinking the tent? Is there, why would, and the questioning is helpful, right? Not with, because we should not judge the viewpoint without understanding the viewpoint, because the other thing that is happening is we have different generational languages about these issues. And the words do not mean the same things.
That's right.
And then sometimes community to community, and we don't have a shared language, and we don't have a process for creating an agreement about how to have these hard conversations respectfully. And so I say that because if I have a conversation that says, well, you know, why are people surrounding students who look Jewish? Like, why? Why aren't they just, why? Like, why is that happening? Well, it's like, well, there's no violence, nobody's touching anybody. I say, yeah, but you got 10 students circling one. If I was the one student, I'd feel scared. Like, so what's the point of that? How is that a dialogue? Where's the opportunity to create a different dialogue? And then it's a conversation, right? But not you're anti-Semitic because you engaged in this behavior, as much as what was the behavior? What were you trying to do? And is there a better way to do it? Because I think so much of what I've heard, and I've also seen, and we have to call it out. We have to call out when when and how we see something that is truly anti-Semitic, for sure, where we have to understand ignorance. Ignorance is real. And there's an opportunity, there's a learning opportunity, and that's where I see a whole lot of opportunity. And then there's also calling out what happens on the other side, because we have seen what we saw happen to some, the headscarves being violently removed from young Muslim women in protests by police is something we have to call out. So I think this point of relationship is we do need an infrastructure. We do need to have a conversation about what it means to build a tent and why we need one. And then in doing that, then how do we talk about the language that does that? Because in the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, there was a lot of that. A lot of it. And it goes sometimes unrecognized. And in the way that we're seeing youth organizing now, often, which is online organizing. and much more decentralized, we've lost the opportunity to think and work and support our young people who have some legitimate discussions, demands that they want to have, and believe and fully feel that they're doing it in appropriate ways. That's ignorance. And then when they have to get called out, and I've had this hard conversation too, is like, no, that's just anti-Semitism, or that's Arab American racism. And I just want to make this other point. When it's Arab American racism, it's critically important to call it Arab American racism, because we have also heard from our Muslim leader, and from our Arab American leaders, and not all Muslims are Arab, and not all Arabs are Muslim. So this is the kind of education we have to do with one another, and that's the point about coalition and relationship and hard conversation. But I make those reflections because they're all solvable, and they all go back to Jamie's point about civic citizenship and how we support civic citizenship and understanding, compassion, learning, and empathizing with one another.
Thank you, Maya. So powerful. Yes.
The only thing, I'll just add, look, I'm on the board of the Hillel at my alma mater. And anyone who knows college students or is involved with what's happening on campus in a number of places, not every campus, but in a number of institutions, right? Jewish students are scared, and it's important to acknowledge that. And it's real. And we have seen some particularly loud voices actively seeking to marginalize Jews, to make Jews feel unsafe on campus. And to Maya's point, we need to be able to understand intent. Because one of the reasons campus has become so polarized is because the entire Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been framed in zero-sum terms for so long. Students have been told, and this was true when I was on campus years ago, and it's been true for years at this point, that you're either with Israel or you're with the Palestinians. And there's no way for students, including the vast majority of students who don't have degrees in Middle Eastern studies, who might not have been to the region, who aren't fundamentally engaged in this, to figure out that you can actually support Palestinian human rights and dignity and statehood, and also not dehumanize Israelis or Jews. And so how do we create that space on campus so that it's not an Israeli flag versus a Palestinian flag, but actually the two together, where people are coming together to say our safety is intertwined, our futures are intertwined. And by creating that complexity, bringing that nuance to the conversation on campus, and frankly more broadly, because many of us adults are guilty of this too, we can begin to show that there is actually a different path, that if you want to support Palestinian humanity and dignity, you don't necessarily have to show up at the encampment where some of the loudest voices have veered into anti-Semitic rhetoric and tropes or actions. You can actually fight for peace in a way that recognizes the humanity of all people. And we need to create that space. And again, it requires coalition building, it requires leaning into the hard conversations, it requires not walking away from the table if someone says something that might be painful or hurtful to you, but rather helping them understand why that is painful or hurtful. Because as Maya said, we don't have the same language. The term Zionist means one very specific thing to me, as someone who identifies as a progressive Zionist. It's being heard entirely different in other spaces. The term ceasefire, shouted from a protester, is very different from someone arguing for a bilateral ceasefire. Terms like intifada, right? These are heard very differently by different people. And so we need to recognize that. We need to help potential allies understand how we as Jews are hearing certain things, hear others when they say they are hearing things a certain way, and create that space for complexity and nuance, because that's the only option we have right now.
It's the only option. I do want to close with a softer question. And it's about balance, honestly, and thinking about your spirituality and your faith practice. How do you use religion at work, or if you use it, do you have a specific practice in your own life that gives you a healthy balance between your personal life and your work life? Because sometimes they are so intertwined. Do you have something that you fall back on?
So I'm a heathen from way back. So, and I say that my parents grew up in very, very, very religious households, and so therefore ours was not. But here's the thing: when I say they were not, meaning they had real tension with organized religion because it could be very oppressive in certain ways. So that was not comfortable to them. But the fundamental values and principles were extremely important. So when I started with Luke, it was because that value that no, you've got a lot, you got to give a lot, and you have to be grateful and recognize that you got a lot, you got to do everything you can, it actually is fundamentally a value that came out of their religious traditions, two different branches of Protestantism. And so from my viewpoint has always been that spirituality is extremely important, and I will go to church. I will, because the community that is created is very important, and the reminder of our humanity is very important. But the actual practice for me is to remember the principles and practice them with people. And that the true, my mother used to say, when I'd asked her if she believed in God, she'd say, well, not if you mean if there's a white man sitting in a throne up in the sky. But she said that because that was her religious tradition, was there was actually a white man on a throne in the sky. And if you played by all the rules, you go sit up in the sky too. And it was literal, right? It's fundamentalist, it was literal. She's like, yeah, no, not. She said, but I believe in, if by God you mean a force that binds and connects us all, then yes. And that is the altar I will always pray at.
It's beautiful, Maya. Thank you.
You know, I think Jewish people have very complex relationships with religion. And I realize I'm saying that in a synagogue, right? None of us practice in the same way. None of us, I think, necessarily approach our religion in the same way, because in many ways, right, Judaism and Jewish peoplehood is as much about our history and our culture as it is about religious tradition and practice. And for me, I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. And I run a Jewish organization. And so I can't separate my Jewish identity from anything I've done, whether it was when I've worked at Jewish organizations or when I worked in government or at non-Jewish or secular organizations. But the consistent thread throughout all of that has been this Jewish identity. It has been the story of my grandparents who survived the unthinkable, whose families were not so fortunate, and who came here in hopes of building a better life for their family, knowing that this place would be safer than what they had just left. And frankly, that was true. We were lucky as white Jews in New York, right? That was true for the vast majority of my parents' life and for most of my life until the last decade or so. This was a very safe place where anti-Semitism was not a real threat. And in some ways, I'm grateful that my grandparents aren't here to see what's happened. But it's that constant thread, knowing that, 2 generations ago, my grandparents fled the unthinkable, survived the unthinkable, fled the unthinkable. They came here. They were a seamstress and a taxi driver. And then my parents were public school teachers in New York. Yeah. And they saw the sort of, as Congressman Raskin described, over the course of those 80 years since they left Europe, they've seen the progress that's happened in this country, not just the move towards more equity, more inclusion, more democracy, but even in their own family, how they've gone from being in a refugee displaced persons camp in Europe to fighting to bring their family here, to their kids, to my mom becoming a public school teacher, to her daughter leading a national Jewish organization, right? There is a trajectory that I think gives me that hope in this moment when it feels like democracy is falling apart and anti-Semitism is inevitable. And it is the same trajectory of so many communities in America as the Congressman described earlier. And so it's that perspective, it's that thread from our history that keeps me, I think, grounded in this moment and reminds me that there's a lot worth fighting for, and that as dark as this moment might seem, we've seen incredible progress in the 80 years since my grandparents showed up here. And if we keep chipping away at it, I think, my daughter's kid, 80 years from now, will hopefully be able to look back and say the same thing.
Yeah, it's powerful. And I think Congressman Raskin said it well, that we are on the precipice of something big happening in a positive way. You mentioned darkness. I think that, a lot happens in the darkness, growth and evolution, and I think we are right on the brink of that. And so I think we will close, and I want to make sure that if you have anything else, closing statement, anything you want to make sure that people walk away with, that I give you an opportunity to do that, maybe 30 seconds or so, and then I think we can wrap up.
Well, if I can say, and one thing is, I agree we're on the precipice, but I don't think it's clear what's on the other side unless we make it clear what's on the other side. And so I will end with one of the quotes I live by and believe deeply in, which is Soren Kierkegaard's definition of hope, which is a passion for what is possible. And the possibility in front of us of a much better, much more unified, much more fair and just, much safer society for all of us is what I'm passionate about, and I hope we can find that passion together, and that's my hope.
Thank you. Thank you, Maya Wiley.
There's not much to add other than I'll just end where we started, which is that as Jews, we need to remember that our safety is inextricably linked with inclusive democracy, the same way that we can't protect our democracy without confronting the insidious anti-Semitism that has become so normalized. And so it's not just between now and November that we need to be mobilizing for democracy. It's each and every day, forward and ongoing, and not losing sight of the fact that there is no Jewish safety without building the multiracial, multi-faith, multi-ethnic, inclusive, pluralistic democracy that has been existential to our own safety here in the United States and is so under threat. And so as Maya said, if we are at this precipice, the only thing we can do is keep fighting to make sure that what's on the other side is something that will continue to protect our community safety and each and every other community's safety.
Can I underscore that point with something very practical? Because Amy's dead on, and as she has been on all night. But the real practical is this election's not going to decide whether we have voting rights. It's what happens after the election. And when you hear things like the incredible racism about Haitian people eating dogs and cats, that's incredibly racist. We just heard a member of Congress yesterday say incredibly racist things against Haitians. But the point is, it's actually part of what they're seeding to argue that we don't need voting rights protection. That we don't need to have a national foundation, that every single state has some of the same rules that protect everybody's ability to vote. And then also John Lewis' Voting Rights Advancement Act to prevent against discrimination in voting. The only reason I want to point that out is because I want to give you something very specific that's deeply coalitional that we're working on, and we're not going to stop fighting on, because what Jamie Raskin said was absolutely true, but not if we don't get voting rights back. There's no freedom to choose. Because the majority wants it, but they jerry-rig the rules. There's no freedom to read the books you want to read because they gerrymander the rules. There's no freedom to decide your own gender identity because they're weaponizing it and using it to undermine voting rights because we are the majority. And that is just a very practical fight. My point about hope is that if we're all fighting that together, that is a pillar we win together, and that we use to continue to do exactly what Goodman, Janey, and Schwerner gave their lives for, and did it together.
Thank you all so much. And thank you all. The amazing Heather Moran, we're turning it over to you.
Oh, thank you. Carol's thing is still there. Thank you to our panelists, and thanks to all of you for joining us. If you could please stay seated while Yolanda and Amy and Maya make their way backstage, that would be wonderful. And then you're going to be free to exit right through the main lobby, and we have autographed books for sale. We have Maya's book, which I cannot wait to read, autographed, and also